tonight. I'm really pleased to be here. I was pleased to get here. Who knew it would take 18 hours to get from Toronto to Charlottesville, but there you go. Joys of modern travel. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is a bit of a concept talk. This draws on a lot of the research that I've done over the last 15 years, but you won't find this in itself as a published piece in the literature yet. It's called Beyond Communication Skills, a rhetorical approach to team communication with implications for teaching and learning. I'm going to step back for a second because you're thinking, a what kind of approach? My PhD is in rhetoric, and rhetoric really boils down to the study of how social groups use language to get things done. So ever since I started my doctoral studies, I've been looking at how healthcare teams use language to get their work done together. And when I talk about a rhetorical approach to team communication, what I'm going to do, I hope, is get you to step back and look from a slightly different angle at the idea of communication skills and consider the implications of that different angle for how we go about teaching communication to novices and how they may go about learning it. I don't even need to tell you that communication is a key dimension of medical expertise. And we all know it's a core competency to acquire. There is not a competency-based framework anywhere in the world that doesn't include it as its own anchor. But it's a very difficult competency to assess. And we have tended to tackle it from the perspective of communication being a skill that's based in individuals. So we ask questions of both novices and our colleagues, is he or she a good communicator? When we give feedback, we say you need to work on your communication. Your communication skills need some development. And when we talk about communication, whether we're talking about it in traditional medical education curricula or more innovative, more recent medical education curricula like IPE, for the most part, we tend to talk about communication as an individual skill base. I pulled these from the ITERs at my school. I just had a look at the ITERs for the IPE competencies here in a conversation with Chris Peterson. These are very similar to the kinds of ITERs we have around communication in any place that I've gone to speak. We talk about people being able to obtain and deliver information. We talk about whether they can listen effectively, whether they can do the complicated things like deliver bad news, etc. These are the kinds of things we're looking for when we teach and assess communication skills. My objectives this afternoon, as I suggested, are to expand our focus, not to get rid of these individual communication skills, but just to look a little bit beyond, to look from a different angle, so that our teaching and learning efforts can better grapple with the complexities of team communication. I don't think the notion of individual communication skills is allowing us to think about team communication and its particular challenges in the way that we need to. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to introduce a rhetorical approach to team communication. I promise. It's just a few minutes of theory. The slides are very nice. It won't be too dreadful. Then I'm going to present three claims. I have boiled this whole idea down to three takeaways, in part because I want you to be able to take them away and ruminate on them. So three claims. And in order to illustrate those claims, I'm going to show you some movies and tell you some stories that come from the research that we've done with a variety of healthcare teams. And I'm going to talk about what these claims might mean for your efforts as teachers, for your efforts as practitioners maybe as well, as team members, and in particular for what we're trying to ask novices to do when they learn team communication. So a rhetorical approach. I will contend that a rhetorical approach will expand our focus from just what goes into communication. So not just what is in this piece of graffiti, the content, the symbols, what's there, but also to what goes on in communication. What's happening when this content is on a wall in a particular city at a particular time and it gets a snapshot and put in the newspaper? What's going on? Not just the content, but also what's happening. The language we use in rhetorical theory for this idea is to push us beyond what are called the descriptive aspects of language, what communication says, to consider what communication does, and that we call the constructive aspects of language, its impacts or its outcomes. One of the central premises of rhetoric is that language doesn't just describe our reality, it actually creates our reality. A very simple example from healthcare: if you decide to call the person whose needs you're trying to meet in the clinic a patient or a client, you have constructed the reality of that relationship in a different way, and different things unfold as possible as a consequence. Now, one of the things that communication does is persuade. If I hadn't gone into medical education, I would have gone into advertising. I'm fascinated by communication's ability to persuade us, to talk us into all kinds of things, to help us talk ourselves into all kinds of things. Another thing that communication does, of particular relevance to health professional education, is socialize. I will argue that the fundamental vehicle we have for turning medical school candidates into physicians of any stripe is the language that we use. With them, at them, to them, for them. So the relationship between rhetoric and communication is really central to the way I'm talking about communication this afternoon. Rhetoric helps us see how communication shapes identities, how it shapes values, and how it makes certain actions more possible than other actions. Rhetoric draws our attention to the social relations that are embodied in all communicative acts. And it provides a set of analytical tools for excavating, bringing to the surface communication practices so that we can discuss them. Rhetoric is particularly good at excavating the mundane, the everyday communication that we don't even really bother to think about, but which really is the glue for everything we do. All right, that's it for the theory. That's enough to anchor you, and if you have questions at the end, I'm happy to elaborate. But be warned, if you ask questions, I will elaborate. So, here are my 3 rhetorical claims about communication with illustrative stories. And the stories are good fun. I hope they will resonate for you. The first claim is this: language is not self-evident. Interpretation is almost everything. For over 10 years, we studied operating room teams. And our overarching goal was to characterize in a systematic and empirical way the nature and the impacts of communication patterns in the operating room. And we did this a lot of different ways. Spent hundreds of hours observing OR teams, interviewed people who work on OR teams individually and in groups. We conducted surveys, we did interventions and measured outcomes. And partway through this research program, we began to talk about what we called the apples and oranges finding. So if we were observing in operating rooms and we saw a kind of a phenomenon, and then we went to ask people who worked in those operating rooms about that phenomenon, you would swear that they hadn't all been in the same operating room that morning. And so because we wanted to explore further whether people really were talking about different things or whether they saw the same thing so very differently that it sounded like apples and oranges, we designed a couple of studies, and this was one of them. We did a survey study where we were focused on trying to figure out the interpretations of communicative tension in the operating room. So we used video scenarios that we developed that dramatized things we'd actually seen over and over again in the OR. And we had those rated in an online format by surgeons, anesthetists, and nurses who we recruited at various national and international surgical conferences. And we asked them to rate these scenarios for the level of tension that they perceived in that communicative event, for who they thought was responsible for creating that tension, and who they thought was responsible for resolving it. I'm going to show you one of the video excerpts. There were 9 of these.
Do you know where Mary is? She was just in 218. How much longer are you guys going to be? Oh, I think we're just about to.
1 hour tops.
Then that's your day, right?
Who's next?
Mrs. Wozniakowski.
Mrs. Wozniakowski? You can't cancel on her. She's come all the way in from Sudbury or someplace way the hell out there. Come on, it's just a goalie.
We can't. There's 4 rooms running late already.
Look,
I
can't believe
we can't.
We were way behind even before I got here. It's just it took so long between the art line and the epidural.
The patient was late because the consent wasn't complete.
There's no more nurses.
Does anybody here work in the operating room? No, not a single person? Good, I'm glad we have one. All right, what we found in this survey study was that interpretations differ. The three professions, surgeons, anesthetists, and nurses, rated tension levels similarly. So that if one profession thought, yeah, it's pretty tense in this scenario, the other two did as well. But they rated each profession's responsibility for creating and resolving the tension differently. And perhaps not surprisingly, they recurrently rated their own profession as having less responsibility. The other thing that's interesting is that ratings differ by profession. So surgeons tend to rate as surgeons, and anesthetists tend to rate as anesthetists. And interestingly, there's also an overall kind of a you broke it, you fix it approach to resolving communicative tension. So if I rate you as having created this tension, I rate you as being responsible for making it go away. This has been confirmed by other survey studies in the literature. For instance, Flynn and colleagues found that surgeons consistently perceive team communication quality to be higher than nurses on their teams do. And team members tend to rate communication differently, whether they're rating a peer or an other. Now, what are the implications of this particular set of findings and this claim for moving beyond communication skills? Well, it suggests that our current curricular focus on teaching people to communicate accurately in terms of their content and to deliver that content clearly and effectively. If you look on your ITERs, you'll find those words, I guarantee it. This is insufficient because delivery isn't the whole package. People need to be developing the skill to assess reception of their messages and to understand that reception, if you're communicating to a team, one member of that team's reception of that accurate and clear message may not be the same as another member's reception. We need to improve novices' awareness that a communication event can be interpreted differently. And there are lots of opportunities in our curricula, we put them in small groups all the time, for them to learn this early on, even before they get into the clinical setting. And there are techniques that they can be taught for assessing reception. Some of these are very prominent in the safety literature, cross-checking kind of techniques to make sure that people heard what you intended them to hear. The second claim. Communication problems aren't just a matter of individual skill. They arise from rhetorical situations. If you look at the medical error literature, you'll know that communication among team members is identified as a root cause in about 70% of medical errors that are subjected to root cause analysis. That depends on whose analysis you're looking at. It goes from 60 to 80%. Individual communication skill is rarely the main issue. I'm not saying it's not at play in some of those situations, but it's almost never the only issue. And it's rarely, I would argue, the dominant issue. Recent research that we and others have done explores why communication breaks down on teams if, in fact, individual communication skill is not the only issue at hand. Team communication problems have been demonstrated to arise as a part of complex situations, and that complexity has been characterized as a combination of high stakes, time pressures, multiple overlapping roles. It's not entirely clear who's doing what in this situation, and multiple competing goals. All of these aspects of the rhetorical situation on a healthcare team contribute enormously to communication problems. Now I'm going to refer to research that we did in the last couple of years on transplantation teams, and I'm going to tell you a story that we published just I guess about 6 months ago in Medical Education, which is designed to try and illustrate this, the rhetorical situation and how its complexity can create communication problems that really don't have a whole lot to do with an individual's communication skill. The purpose of this research that I'm drawing on was to describe the patterns of teamwork and communication in a complex distributed setting. After a decade of studying teams in fairly confined domains like the operating room, we wanted to study some different kinds of teams where people were spread all over the organization. They didn't share time and space. They were distributed. So this was one of the settings that we chose. And we were particularly interested in looking at these complex distributed settings and how teams function in them. We wanted to make sure we weren't just characterizing how communication broke down, because communication breaks down all the time in distributed settings. We were attuned to how do those teams improvise in a daily way so that almost in spite of the potential for breakdown when you're communicating with people who you don't see face to face, who don't work in the same part of the organization as you do, et cetera, how is it that teams get the work done through communication in an improvisational way? This was an ethnographic study. We did observation with the transplant teams, conducted a number of interviews in the field, where that's when you're following someone around and you ask them on the fly, what was that about? We also conducted formal interviews. There were 40 consented team members, 52 complete patient cases, so we followed the team from that patient's admission to their transplant, and they might have been admitted a number of times in that period, and 3 return of findings focus groups. I'm not spending a lot of time on methodology in this lecture, but if you have questions about that, I'm happy to take them at the end. Our analytical procedures were fairly standard for a qualitative approach. We did iterative thematic analysis. What that means is that you're analyzing the data while you're collecting it, and your data collection is focused to probe further emergent themes as they come out. We also did something that's a little bit different for this kind of ethnographic study, and that's that we sliced the data not only by observation sessions, but also by patient. So we ended up with 52 patient cases where we had assembled observational interview data relevant to that case. And we did the kind of individual and group coding that would be usual. We had a number of very central key informants, both from the transplant team, but also a few who were from other teams like critical care that the transplant team was quite closely linked to. And we would cycle back to those people and say, this is what we're seeing. What do you think? What else should we be looking for? What have we missed? That kind of thing. Key informants are essential in this kind of work. So now I'm going to tell you a story about the transplant team. And in the literature, this paper's main title is Representing Complexity Well. Mr. Hearn is a 56-year-old man with end-stage disease. A few weeks ago, he had an admission to the transplant unit for assessment. And during that admission, he was assessed by members of the team from medicine, surgery, and anesthesia regarding his suitability as an organ recipient. In addition to his organ failure, which is non-cardiac, Mr. Hearn has a heart stent, causing anesthesia to be cautious about his appropriateness for listing. The consulting anesthesiologist tells the transplant nurse practitioner that the patient needs a left heart catheterization before transplant should be considered. Mr. Hearn is discharged home with the goal of building him up nutritionally. A week later, Mr. Hearn is admitted to the ICU. In the morning following admission, he's characterized by the transplant team at morning rounds as crashing, and they express a sense of urgency about getting him on the list. They're worried that if they wait, he'll become too hemodynamically unstable to transplant. Before transplantation, however, the residual issue from the last admission needs to be resolved. Can his heart withstand the surgery? Answering this question requires the transplant team to facilitate a process of negotiation between the conflicting clinical opinions of the anesthesiology and the cardiology services. These are excerpts from interview data. Here's the transplant nurse practitioner. There was anesthesia, cardiology, and us, and ourselves in anesthesia felt that the patient needed a left-sided heart cath prior to listing, and cardiology disagreed with that. One of the transplant staff says cardiology was ordering a CAT scan, and it was coronary arteries, and anesthesia said, I don't care what the result is, that's not good enough, we want a cath. And the cath guy says, well, I'm not doing a cath because you don't need a cath, and anesthesia says, well, we're not doing a transplant then, and we're stuck in the middle going, guys, figure this out. One of the transplant surgeons reflected this way. Sometimes the comment is made by cardiology that anesthesia is being overly cautious. And anesthesia is saying, well, cardiology is not in the OR, and they don't know everything that we have to deal with. And the transplant fellow sums up the eventual decision this way. He says the compromise between all 3 services is to order a CT angiogram, which is performed in radiology. But then the radiologist wanted the heart rate to be much better controlled prior to doing a CT coronary angiogram because they felt the false positive rating would be way too high with a high heart rate, so they didn't want to do the scan. Does this feel like anybody's life? A little bit of head nodding. All right, I could go on and on. This is a really robust case in the data, but I don't have time. There are lots more chapters. Some of them have to do with fellows trying on this communication and then staff trying it the next day once they've had a go, et cetera. Eventually, with the transplant team persisting towards the goal of negotiating an agreeable plan and really using all kinds of strategies, they get satisfied. They don't give up. Their patience is tried. They do end up transplanting Mr. Hearn successfully. And there are lots of iterations to this, but you get the main point. It might be tempting to look at that example and say, that is some poor teamwork they've got going on there in London, Ontario. But this isn't actually poor teamwork. And it's certainly not a lack of individual communication skill. This is the everyday bread and butter of teamwork in a distributed setting. And I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm not saying it's excellent, but this is every day. This is not the far end of the scale of bad. This is what collaboration looks like in a complex system, where everybody has competing preferences, competing goals, different organizational structures, different funding mechanisms, et cetera, such that the communication required to achieve even a single decision ends up being multi-layered, multifaceted, and extending over many days, many conversations in many parts of the organization. So I said at the beginning that the second claim is that communication problems don't just arise from individual skill. They emerge from rhetorical situations. So let's do a little analysis of this situation. What is it about this situation that makes it so complex? Well, I'm going to focus on three things. There are more, but I think these are fundamental. The fluidity of professional roles, the shifting locus of authority as a decision works its way forward, and layers of motivations. Now, what do I mean by those things? Professional roles and authority. It is not a simple thing to answer the question, who is the heart expert here? And who is the most responsible service? Often that's a trump card that gets played. We're the most responsible service, and therefore. But in many situations like this, everybody thinks they're the most responsible service. Similarly, their professional roles are fluid. It's not that cardiology does this, and anesthesiology does this, and transplant does this. And we all know where the boundaries are, and we know when we're getting close. And no, they're fluid. Their roles are fluid. And therefore, the locus of authority on the team is shifting, and it's subject to contextual influence. What is the nuance of today's decision as compared to yesterday's decision? An effective team communication has to be aware of, attuned to, this fluidity and able to respond to it. If you go into this kind of communication assuming, listen, you do that and I do this, and you just do your job and let me make my decision, then this will take many more iterations than it might otherwise take. Now, what do I mean by layers of motivation? I said that that was at play in making this rhetorical situation complex as well. Well, I think there are lots of motivations influencing what people are doing and saying, and that none of them are actually inappropriate or irrelevant. So you can't rule out someone's preferred choice by saying your motivation's wrong. So what are the motivations at play? Well, there's the aim to protect scarce cardiology resources. There's the need to guard against adverse intraoperative events. There's the desire to provide timely care to this patient. There's a mandate to give fellows a chance to try out these communications before the staff just pick up the phone and have that expert, authoritative conversation. All of these motivations are appropriate and relevant, but they're in competition with one another in this particular communicative event. So what are the implications of this for moving our thinking beyond individual communication skills? Well, I would argue that we need to better equip trainees, maybe expert practitioners as well, to judge and navigate complex situations where Roles are overlapping. It is not, I'm a big proponent of IPE, but it is enormously insufficient to imagine that if we teach one another our respective roles, then we'll be able to work together. That implies that roles are stable, and on the ground, roles are not stable. Authority needs to be negotiated. Most responsible service is a moving target in examples like this. And novices need to be attuned to that and have sophisticated strategies for dealing with that as the communication unfolds. And complicated motives are the name of the game. When you're doing the kind of work you're doing and you're caring for patients and you're training novices and everybody's trying to negotiate what will happen because we're caring collaboratively, it's not a solution to say, we're all here for the patient. I hear that quite often. Well, if you were just here for the patient, we're all supposed to be here for the patient. That is not a trump card here because everybody has almost equally valuable motivations in this scenario. All right, claim number 3. Meaning emerges not only from spoken language, from what we say, but also from silence, from all the things we don't say. It's interesting, as a communications researcher, I would say I studied healthcare teams for over a decade before one day it hit me smack in the middle of the forehead that I was completely ignoring all the things people don't say. And as you know, from any social communication, whether it's at your dinner table or in your workplace, the things that never get said are sometimes more influential than the things that do get said. One of the signs of an expert communicator is their ability to read between the lines. You know, when you get novices on your team and they don't know the context, and the big faux pas they make in the first few days may be because they didn't read between the lines. They couldn't intuit what was expected but not said, all right? So since that aha moment, which was very long in coming, I've tried to conduct research that acknowledges that team communication exists in a spectrum of speech and silence, and I've tried to design methodologies that can have a radar out for both speech and silence. What's interesting from an educational perspective is that the way we traditionally approach communication skills, both teaching and probably even more so assessing communication skills, privileges speech. I mean, this is a kind of a psychometric conundrum, isn't it? How would you reliably and validly assess what's not there? I mean, there's kind of an interesting, I don't know what to call it, philosophical question, I guess. Philosophical and psychometric doesn't go in the same bucket for me, but that's probably my own thing. So we traditionally disregard silence when we talk about communication skills in health professions training. And this is problematic because silence is everywhere. When I go back and I look at the field notes from all those years studying operating room teams, there are more references to nobody's really saying anything right now. The observer thinking, I wonder if I should leave. Nobody said anything for 40 minutes. I'm thinking this isn't a good day today. When in fact, there's all kinds of communication going on, but it's unspoken. But all the people working in that room know what's being communicated. The observer does not. I want to share with you 2 distinctive examples. One from the OR data, because I think silence has some particular characteristics there, which may be instructive in other settings. And then one from training data, a different training study. So here's an example from the OR data. These are in the observer's field notes. The circulating nurse and the scrub nurse are doing their count near the end of the case. The surgical resident requests 4 Vicryl, please, from the scrub nurse. The scrub nurse's back is to him. She doesn't immediately respond. The resident requests again with a slightly louder voice. Can I get a 4 Vicryl, please? The nurse still doesn't respond. The surgical resident raises his eyebrow at the junior resident across the table. A few moments later, the count is done. The nurse repeats 4 Vicryl, handing the suture. The resident takes it, appears irritated, sighing loudly and shaking his head. What does the nurse's silence mean in this communicative scenario? Well, there are a number of options. It could mean the nurse didn't hear the request. As the scenario unfolds, you realize that's not the case. But sometimes silence doesn't mean anything except that the communicative event wasn't received and therefore isn't being responded to. Could also mean that the nurse did hear the request, but they're prioritizing the counting activity and holding off responding. Additionally, it could mean that the nurse heard the request, prioritized the counting activity, and seeks to delay the closure until the count is complete and uses silence as a way to achieve that goal while avoiding overt conflict with the resident. It's interesting, as soon as we started to be alerted to silence in the last couple OR studies, we trained the observers to take field notes like that could signal objectively the cues for silence. And some of them, like this one, you could unravel analytically for pages and pages. And when we take them back and talk to people about this, well, they go on and on at length about the sophisticated ways in which they use silence on purpose in a hierarchical environment to get things done while making the least waves possible. Now, sometimes silence fails in that regard and the waves get bigger instead of smaller, but that's another topic. So what silence means in a particular situation obviously depends, and it matters. It matters because silence is not the absence of meaning. In fact, it's not the absence of communication, it's the absence of spoken language. Silence can be purposeful and meaningful. It can be functional or dysfunctional. In a paper I published last year on kind of frontiers in communications and patient safety research, I talked at length about one of the blind spots of patient safety kind of theory or science, which I think is the assumption that silence is dysfunctional, that silence produces errors. I think silence can produce errors, but it doesn't always. It has functionality as well. Some silences reflect linguistic conventions. So something that's called turn taking. If we're in a conversation and you're having your turn, I'm being silent. There's no particular meaning expressed by that except that I am observing the sanctioned conventions and respecting you by letting you take your turn. Other silences are what we would call communicative acts. They have embodied purpose. We're using silence to do something specific, like that nurse, if in fact she's using it to avoid overt conflict but still delay the close. And in fact, if you're interested in silence, maybe not surprisingly, one of the literatures that has spoken the most to this issue is the nursing research literature. And they talk about silence as being revealing of power relations and communicative constraints. So here's my second instance of silence and why I think it's important from the perspective of how we teach communication skills and what we're alert to in those settings. This is a video that we used in a series of studies where we had people look at these videos and then talk to us about what the student should do in this situation. But I'm using it to illustrate the silence thing here. This particular study that the video comes from was a study of trainees' willingness to admit uncertainty or ask for help. We were interested when they find themselves in that clinical team situation, what makes them admit they don't know something and ask for supervision, and what makes them hide the fact that they don't know something and soldier on their own. And this was a nationally funded study trying to get the balance right between supervision and safety. This was also an observational study with 12 different clinical teaching teams, half in internal medicine and half in emerge, number of interviews and formal interviews using these video scenarios which represented scenarios that we'd observed. So here's the video.
The woman in 11, bad bill pain, we could case for you. Tell me what you're done.
I did my anesthesia rotation last month. Would you mind if I started the IV?
You've done some?
Yeah, anesthesia, tons, maybe 50.
Okay, well, if you're comfortable starting, you need me to stay?
No, I think I got it.
Sure.
It's Thomas, right? Everything good in here?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you.
So what influences trainees to be silent or to speak up in a situation where they need help? This particular study, which was led by Tara Kennedy, who was a doctoral student of mine at the time, revealed 3 factors that influence trainee silence: clinical, supervisor, and trainee factors. Let me walk you through them. There were 2 kinds of clinical factors: the nature of the clinical situation and perceptions of clinical scope of practice. So here's a PGY3 saying, the other day when this guy came in short of breath, he just didn't look good. He was working so hard to breathe, and I was like, this guy could get really sick really fast. So I just ran out and called the 5th-year emerge resident. So if this clinical situation signals to me big trouble, they'd be more likely not to be silent. Scope of practice, by that, was meant situations like the one this clinical clerk in 4th year talks about. You're expected to make certain decisions by yourself at a certain stage of training, and you're really inconveniencing someone else by asking them. So the sense that even though I feel like I don't know this, I feel like I should know this, and so I'm not going to say I don't know. Supervisor factors also broke into 2 different kinds of categories: availability and approachability. Availability gets at what this 1st-year resident described as, especially if staff are very busy, running around answering pages, it can make it tough to sort of stick your head in and say, can we review a case, or I have a question. So just the busyness of the environment as perceived by the trainee. Approachability was the sense that, as this person put it, there are certain staff that are known for, they don't like to be bothered. You feel that if you call them, they'll feel, why didn't you look after it yourself? They'll think less of you. So a perception that the trainee has of the approachability of their staff person can also influence whether they decide to speak up or be silent. And finally, there were 3 trainee factors. The first was expertise. When people don't know how or when to call for help, they don't know what they don't know or what's potentially really important. That's when bad things can happen. So this sense of, if you don't have insight into the fact that you don't know, if your expertise isn't good enough for you even to see the gap in your knowledge, then you might not speak up. This has been talked a lot in the self-assessment literature as a fundamental problem. The second trainee factor was a desire for independence. So as this person put it, getting a procedure done by yourself when you're a junior, it's really satisfying, and you might try not to ask for help. There was also this sense related to the scope of practice issue of working above your year or above your level, demonstrating that you're excelling. And finally, and not surprisingly at all, the ever-present evaluation and assessment. So as this 1st-year resident said, I want to look like I'm independent and I can handle questions on my own. You want to impress. And as the PGY4 said, evaluations are all subjective, right? So you piss off the guy by waking him up, and he's going to give you a bad evaluation. If that matters to you, you won't wake him up. So these 3 factors for the trainees in our study had an influence on whether they would speak up in a situation where they found themselves a little out of their depth, or whether they would be silent in that situation. Others have studied this phenomena. There was an interesting study almost a decade ago now in JGEM that talked about a number of other factors that influence trainee silence, including how hierarchical the team culture is, gender and culture differences in trainees, fatigue and stress, and disagreements over ethical issues. So what are the implications of this claim that we need to be attuned to silence because speech isn't the only way we communicate? What are the implications of that for my thesis that we need to move beyond communication skills? Well, I think the implications for clinical supervisors are that it's very important to know some of these factors that influence trainees to speak up or stay silent. And anybody in this room who's a clinical faculty member, you know them in your gut. But to know them sort of heuristically and have a language for them might be even more helpful. And also, with that knowledge, to set expectations for your novices. This is what I expect you to ask help around. This is where your level is. Many trainees talk to us about their level in a way that suggested they think the level they should be at is actually higher than the level they should be at because of this desire to impress. So saying, here are the things beyond which I really expect to hear from you is one way. And as team members, regardless of whether you're dealing with novices or other colleagues, learn to listen for patterns of silence. As someone who studies teams, I mean, all I do for a living is I go in and I listen to teams, I talk to team members about what I heard and try and figure out, how does this team communicate? How does that affect their ability to provide care together? I can tell you that there are patterns to silence. Those patterns are context-specific, there are specialty-specific patterns, there are organization-specific patterns, there are interpersonal patterns. So some pairings of people produce different kinds of patterns than others. If you just briefly think over the landscape of your teamwork experiences, I'm sure you will notice that there are patterns of silence in your working. Learn to listen for them and reflect on the ways in which they're functional and dysfunctional. I'll revisit a point I made a few minutes ago. I think that one of the signs of an expert communicator is the ability to accurately interpret silence and use it strategically. We do not teach that to novices in any kind of formal curricular way. They learn it by trial and error. They get into a lot of trouble along the way, some of them. And I think there are ways to teach this. We could be more strategic about it. So in summary, I've argued this afternoon that a rhetorical approach can help us to shift the way we teach and learn communication so that we're considering not only the traditional focus on individual communication skills, we shouldn't throw that baby out with the bathwater, but that we could expand that towards curricular efforts that acknowledge what communication does in complex social situations, particularly vis-a-vis teamwork. The three rhetorical claims I made were these: that language is not self-evident, interpretation is almost everything. Communication problems aren't just a matter of individual skill. They arise from rhetorical situations. And meaning emerges not only from speech, but also from silence. Some of the questions that I'll leave you with: what do we hear when our colleagues speak? How good is your ear for silence? What kind of recurrent situations on our teams produce communication problems? When does that apples and oranges finding come into play in your own setting, where you're sure you said one thing, but everybody else seems to have heard something else? How does silence work on your particular team, and when is it working functionally and strategically, and we should actually cultivate that, and when is it dangerous or problematic? And how are silences particularly implicated in your training settings? As you all know, training settings too have their own flavor and culture, and that influences how silence works in them. So think about your own training setting. I'll close by acknowledging the funding organizations that have supported the research that informs this work, and all of my research collaborators on those many studies who I can't explicitly acknowledge, and the graduate students who've also contributed. And I'll be very pleased to take your questions and comments. Thank you.
I'm having a tough time envisioning how one would teach reading silence for all situations in a more general sense rather than in a particular instance. Could you maybe give an example of how one would teach that?
So at the generalizable level, not the context-specific level. Sure. So step one is to say we communicate through silence. That's ubiquitously true, and we don't talk about that. Step two would be to say sometimes silence is on purpose and sometimes it's not. Because you don't want people over-interpreting, going around sort of paranoid that every little silence means something. Step three, I think, would be to say, when you're not sure what a silence means, here are the ways in which you can probe that safely. So general strategies: if you're not sure, what might you do? You don't want to embarrass, we're talking about trainees now. You don't want to embarrass yourself. Trainees are very loath to speak up if they think they should have got something that everybody else got tacitly. They need strategies for doing that and judging when it's safe to do that. Those would be three ways I would start. And then you could draw on particular examples. So in this situation, so I've seen surgeons, for instance, come out of the OR and talk about silence reactively, usually a silence that either irritated them or that they found problematic. But I have never seen a surgeon go into the operating room and before that talk proactively about silence. So for instance, you know what? We may get a lot of bleeding in this case. And often when I ask the anesthetist about the bleeding, they don't say anything the first 2 times I ask them. There are patterns of silence that you could speak to if you think they're really important to the trainee's ability to learn how to productively interact with the rest of the team in recurring situations. Does that help?
Yep.
There was a hand at the back.
I wondered if you've looked at written communication and rhetoric, because we're dispersed over time in geography, but also we do a lot of email, text paging, staff messages in our electronic medical record, and there's a lot of silence and delays in responding that can be misinterpreted.
So it's a great question. The question was about whether we've studied written communication and patterns of silence, because what I talked about here is all oral communication, verbal. Yes, we have. And so just we've done work on referral and consultation letters. That work's pretty old now. It's about 9 years old. More recently, and I think more interestingly, we've done work on electronic patient records. Do you have an EPR system here? Okay. So I had a couple of doctoral students who studied electronic patient records, particularly to look at how trainees learn what they should do when the EPR won't let them do what they want to do. So all those times people are sitting at the screen and it won't let them do what they want, so they do something else. And then we explored the difference between what we called savvy communicators, people who realized that when someone else on the team looked at that thing they did, they might actually misinterpret it. So you wrote a free text entry because you couldn't get the field you wanted to come up. We interviewed people who actually then went and talked to other people on the team and said, listen, I ended up having to write this because I couldn't sit there forever, but I want to make sure you understand that, ... to try and understand how people were predicting the interpretations other people might have of what they'd written. So back to that interpretations almost everything point. So we've done some of that work. The first author on that series of papers, the last name is Varpio. So we have done, not nearly as much as the oral stuff. We're right now doing a study in with patients with advanced heart failure, and the question of how or whether or if palliative care could be integrated into their trajectory, and we're doing document analysis and this ethnographic methodology at the same time. So it's really important. We've done a bit of it. There was one in the middle.
Thank you. This was a wonderful talk, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about it for a while after you leave. Wondered if you might comment on 3 things. They're somewhat related. The influence of affect on these complex communications. In other words, cultivating positive emotion in a team versus negative. So that's one. The second is the influence of relationships and how complex teams developing relationships, whether they're in the moment or over time, how that affects communication. And then third, how framing affects communication in these either complex or simple situations. And we have a great story about framing that I have to tell. It's such a great story. We had a resident call up in the middle of the night wanting to admit a patient from the ED to his fellow team members on the floor. And instead of saying, you know, I have this 89-year-old guy with urosepsis, he said, I have someone, a member of the greatest generation who needs your help. And the way that the resident received that patient was totally different because of the way that the resident in the ED had framed this situation. So those 3 things, have you any comments on those?
Sure. So I'm going to put the first one and the third one together, affect and framing, because they're both related to the first premise, which is that interpretation is everything. And also, they're both related to the fundamental theoretical construct, which is that what we're interested in is not only what language says, but what it does. So these, particularly the resident who called up with the framing example, that person is a rhetorician at heart. They understand that the way you put it will shape what the person does with it. And that's what language is for. I mean, I'm not talking about people speaking more fluently or prettily or more politely, and that we could have a great debate about that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people speaking in ways that strategically shape other people's actions so that the collaboration can actually go forward. Affect is central to that. And in fact, I often get asked about the emotional intelligence question, and I'm not enormously familiar with that literature. My literature and that literature very rarely merge, and I think that's telling. It's a gap in the science. But that is related to the understanding of affect and its power. It's one thing to teach people to deliver information clearly. It's quite another to teach them to deliver it in a way that purposefully shapes the other person's emotional response. And that's what expert communicators are doing in social situations. I'm just having an email conversation right now at a distance with a graduating postdoc who's about to negotiate her first job. And I'm trying to talk to her about A, how you do that content-wise, B, how you do it in a way that doesn't make you seem greedy, that controls the affect, and C, how you frame it so that the other people receive it and act in the way you wish them to. Because negotiating on your first offer could be seen as, you know, really presumptuous, rather than saying, thank you very much, I'm delighted to have my first job. So this is relevant everywhere, and all three of those things are really great points. The middle one was relationships. It's related to the other two, but one of the things that I have found, most of my study settings have been in situations where we're not talking about stable teams. We're not talking about teams where, in the OR, for example, the surgeon and the anesthetist are paired and always work together. And in the UK, when I go to speak about those data, they're very quick to tell me, we're paired, and what you're talking about is very different from our experience because we have a historical relationship. The other piece about relationship that I just have to mention because it's so cool, and I'm embarking on a study of it now, humor is also central to sophisticated communication. Humor depends fundamentally on relationship. And so think about all those situations where you get a new trainee of whatever level on your team and they blow humor. They get humor wrong, right? Why does that happen? In many cases it happens because they use humor in a way they see others using it, but without the underpinning relationships that make it work. So I'm interested in relationship, but particularly as it relates to humor.
So I was, while you were talking, by the way, it's a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed it. And I was thinking, you know, everyone here must realize how important communication is, therefore we all come here. But communications cannot be improved, you know, with a small group of people. And I have been observing the people who are not good at communication, they don't realize it. They don't attend the workshop. So what do you think? How do we deal with that?
So I spend most of my life preaching to the converted. Absolutely. I try and alter that. So this isn't the question you asked, but I must tell you that. What I try and do, if I'm asked to give a surgical grand rounds, a nursing grand rounds, or an anesthesia grand rounds, one of the requirements for me to come and give the grand rounds is that they invite the other two professions to the grand rounds. It's often the very first time it's ever happened. And I do that in part so that I'm not just preaching to the converted. So what do you do about that? I think I'm a glass half full kind of person in that regard, because I have seen many instances where the person who has the skills and the rhetorical insight to, I'm going to use the word control even though it sounds Machiavellian, control the situation, can move a group even when everybody else in the group is not a converted person. I think it is possible to do this. Is it frustrating and humbling? Yes, it is. But I think it's possible. And I think that because trainees will find themselves re-experiencing that every single time they move training culture. They may find a culture where this is valued and where there's a particular collaborative teamwork communication spirit. Highly unlikely that the next place they go to is going to duplicate that. So it kind of behooves us to acknowledge to them that they're going to experience that we experience it in our workplace, and that you can still move forward strategically even though that is your reality. It's a bit of a pie in the sky, Pollyanna answer, not a very good answer probably. Do we have time for one more, or are we done?
Just one more thing. What you said about not working in teams that are longitudinally related, I'm wondering if there's a social network that, despite the fact that a team member might, I might not know George, but I know of George because I have a relational network that has said something to me about George, despite the fact that I've never worked with him and I've never actually, I don't actually personally know him. And that somehow working with that, in that relational network, to, if you will, kind of craft a relationship that is positive before one actually meets one another, is one way of actually creating relationship when there isn't one already. So that when team members work for the first time together, it's as though they have known each other. And they have an assumption of positive intent because that social network has built it. Have you worked?
I agree with you. I would only elaborate it to say it works both ways. People make assumptions of negative intent because they've heard the mythical reports of how horrible so-and-so is. So I like this idea of a relational network. It is definitely true because it influences the predictions people make before they embark on any particular communicative event, and that shapes the choices that they make when whatever language comes out of their mouth. The other part of this that has started to intrigue me, I've started to write about competence as a word, as an idea, because I think competence is also an individualist construct, and the way it's set up in the literature does not allow us to grapple very well with a situation where in some teams, one problematic individual makes the whole team fall apart. Other teams neutralize that problematic individual so that the team carries forward almost in spite of. What kind of competence is that? How do we grapple with that? And I think it's related in part to what you're talking about.